Welcome to the fourth and final talk of our series on romance and reality in French literature from the 19th to the 20th century. In this talk, we will look at the period that extends from the Belle Époque in the 1900s to the aftermath of the Second World War and the Cold War. We have seen that the French Revolution marks a decisive turning point in the French political and intellectual landscape. The events of 1789 and later the execution of King Louis XVI in 1793 were a point of no return. The Napoleonic Empire put an end to the chaos and terror of the First Republic, but the Napoleonic dream came to an end with the exile of the emperor and the restoration of the absolute monarchy under Louis XVIII and Charles X. However, the July Revolution in 1830 brought to power a brief constitutional monarchy under Louis-Philippe, which was followed by an even shorter Second Republic in 1848. In 1852, the first president of the Second Republic, Louis-Napoléon Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon, declared himself Empereur des Français. Under his reign, France recovered economic stability through the expansion of industrialization. But in 1870, the Second Empire collapsed when the French troops were crushed by Prussia in Sedan. France lost l'Alsace et la Lorraine, and the Third Republic was proclaimed. The Third Republic was the longest regime since the French Revolution. During its 70 years, French society changed radically. It was marked by the Dreyfus affair from 1894 to 1906, when a Jewish military officer was unjustly accused of spying. Writers like Émile Zola or Anatole France and artists like Sarah Bernard stood to defend Capitaine Dreyfus until his rehabilitation, but the affair brought to light the anti-Semitism of the far right. The law on mandatory education in 1882 led to the unification of French language and the extinction of regional languages. The law on the secularization of the public service in 1905 caused many teaching orders to be expelled towards Britain or completely dismantled, which accelerated the decline of the clergy's authority, but also led to the Catholic revival of the 1890s. The loss of the Alsace and the Lorraine nurtured a strong anti-Prussian feeling, which justified the French enthusiasm in going to war against recently unified Germany in 1914. France recovered l'Alsace-Lorraine after the war and obtained heavy reparations through the Traité de Versailles, but 1/3 of the Frenchmen between 18 and 27 lost their life during the conflict. The battles of the First World War took an unprecedented proportion. The long periods of waiting in the trenches were only separated by the blast of rockets, gas bombs, and violent charges. Modern warfare turned the battlefields of the North into a slaughterhouse. After the war, the Roaring Twenties, or les années folles in French, marked a period of frenetic artistic renewal. The radio helped trends and fashions travel from country to country, and popular music and jazz invited themselves into people's homes. In Paris, the youth that was too young for going to war fraternized with the soldiers who came back, often with horrible wounds that earned them the names of broken faces, les gueules cassées. The artistic youth of Britain and the United States ran to Paris to perfect their musical or literary talents. The financial crash of 1929 increased the interest in unionization and in socialist and communist politics, while the Great Depression contributed to a distrust towards the political class and to a general sense of gloom, corroborated by the information warfare. As Bernanos wrote in La France contre les robots much later in 1947, to be informed of everything and thus condemned to understand nothing, such is the fate of the imbeciles. Être informé de tout et ainsi condamné à ne rien comprendre, tel est le sort des imbéciles. The growing power of fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and Spain, and the increasing power of the communists at the East were documented and shared through the press, the news broadcasts on the radio, in the cinema, then on the television. The increasing power of the communists and the socialists at the East destabilized the trust in the Third Republic. It lasted until 1940, when France fell in front of Hitler's Third Reich and resigned to occupation. France was divided between the occupied zone and the French state of Vichy under Maréchal Pétain, one of the heroes of the First World War. The humiliations inflicted by Germany, the compromises required by the collaborationist regime, and the active participation in the deportation of the Jews and the repression of the resistance made the 1940s one of the darkest decades in French history. The end of the 1940s and the 1950s were marked by the necessity to create social concord again. The Fourth Republic, from 1946 to 1958, had to face the difficult reunification of a fragmented country through the trial and execution of the main agents of collaboration, but also by amnesty, especially the amnesty law signed on the 5th of January 1951. After the liberation, le Général de Gaulle imposed himself as the unifying leader of Free France. Although his speech on the 18th of June 1940 received little to no attention when it aired in the BBC's London studio, de Gaulle's Appel du 18 juin 40 was a key factor in establishing the legitimacy of the Republic after the war. De Gaulle and his supporters claimed that the Republic had never ceased to exist, but had simply been in exile. The Vichy regime was declared null and void. The Fourth Republic collapsed because of the tension between Republicans and Communists, while the decolonization in the Far East revealed the fragility of France's colonial empire. Charles de Gaulle, who was head of the provisional government after the liberation between 1944 and 1946, was called by President René Coty to form a government. De Gaulle ended up proposing a new constitution, which led to the establishment of the Fifth Republic in 1958. From the defeat of Sedan to the aftermath of the Second World War, France's intellectual life was shaped by the confrontation with violence and with the banality of evil. Some believed that humanity as a whole should come together in order to prevent any new war. Writers wondered more than ever before about the tension between what is good, what is beautiful, and what is just. Does beauty still matter when bombs burst? And if evil is so inevitable, what does it mean to be good? The human condition, with all its contradictions, became the center of focus of authors as different as Guillaume Apollinaire, Albert Camus, or Georges Bernanos. In order to appreciate the density of the period, we would have to bear in mind that the main authors of the late 19th century were still alive into the 20th century. Félicien Champsaur, one of the most creative and prolific fin de siècle authors, was born in 1858, and the novels he wrote during the Belle Époque and at the start of the Roaring Twenties echo all the modern trends: Spiritism, jazz, and Egyptology. Paul Bourget, who was born in 1852 and contributed to the establishment of the psychological novel, only died in 1935, and his novel Un drame dans le monde, published in 1921, is a bitter sketch of the collapsing social structures of Parisian aristocracy in the immediate aftermath of the war. Whether they were mobilized, joined the army willingly, or stayed away from the battlefield, the generation that witnessed the First World War still had direct or reported memories of the previous Franco-Prussian War. Someone born in 1870 would only be 70 in 1940. It is because they remembered the past, or forged an idealized version of it, that this generation gave its name to La Belle Époque. Similarly to Edith Wharton describing pre-war New York in The Age of Innocence, the last years before the collapse of Europe seemed to be the twilight of a certain understanding of civilization. The First World War was known in French as La Grande Guerre. Henri Barbus's novel Le Feu, published in 1916 and based on notes he took while on the front, reveal one of the shifts in war literature. Still influenced by naturalism, Barbus wished to grasp the particular atmosphere of the war, its language, its reality, and its tension between hope and hopelessness. In that mess of mud and blood, there is not much room left for heroism. The novel was acclaimed, and the funds raised through it helped support the war veterans. Yet Le Feu also received some criticism. Jean Horton-Creux, for instance, had a particular interest in the very question of testimony, and he noticed that Henri Barbusse had failed to grasp the psychological burden of the war. The war did shake norms that had survived in the several waves of artistic renewal in the 19th century, as can be seen through the works of Guillaume Apollinaire. In Alcool, published right before the war in 1913, Apollinaire collected poems that still owe a lot to the symbolist vein. He refers to the famous feminine figures that inspired others before him, Salome, Lorelei, Viviane, in a form where classical poetry alternates with free verse. But some of his poems, like Zone or Le Pont Mirabeau, also inherit Baudelaire and Verlaine's wish to merge the description of perennial feelings with the fleeting scenes of modernity. Born a Polish subject of the Russian Empire, Guillaume Apollinaire joined the French army because he loved France, French art, French poetry, and above all, the French language. His poems to Louise de Coligny-Châtillon, collected posthumously in the Poèmes à Loup, combine classical poetry and modern experimentations on shapes and sounds. During the war, Apollinaire's style did indeed become more experimental. If we look at Si je meurs là-bas, for instance, we find that the last stanza is meant to use the classical Alexandrine verse, but the poem ends in an acrostic. Loup, si je meurs là-bas, souvenir qu'on oublie, souviens-t'en quelquefois aux instants de folie, de jeunesse et d'amour et d'éclatante ardeur, mon sang c'est la fontaine ardente du bonheur, et sois la plus heureuse, étant la plus jolie, ô mon unique amour et ma seule folie. Loup, if I die over there, a forgotten memory, remember it sometimes in moments of bliss, of youth and of love and of bursting ardor. My blood is the burning fount of happiness, and be the happiest, being the prettiest. Yet this poem ends in an acrostic where the first letters from the name and the first letters of the last verses of the poem form the name Loup. La nuit descend, on y pressent un long destin de sang. Night is falling, foreshadowing a lengthy fate of bleeding. Apollinaire pursues into the 20th century the symbolist quest for unity between sign and meaning through a shape he invents, the calligramme, poems in the shape of what they describe, such as the one describing the Eiffel Tower and making the analogy between the French language, the French tongue, and the tongue poked at the Germans in spite of everything. Rather than the horrors of war, Apollinaire focuses on the wonder of life and the metamorphosis of a soul in love. He received French citizenship while at war in 1916. A few days later, he was wounded at the head and had to undergo trepanation. This is one of the most mysterious and surreal anecdotes of French literature. In 1914, the Italian painter Giorgio de Chirico had completed a portrait named L'Homme Cible. In 1914, the Italian painter Giorgio de Chirico had completed a portrait of Apollinaire titled L'Homme Cible, which will be renamed Portrait prémonitoire de Guillaume Apollinaire, because a wide white circle of light falls exactly where Apollinaire was wounded. Apollinaire is greatly weakened by his surgery, but still active in the artistic and intellectual world. He coins the word surrealiste, describing his play Les Mamelles de Tirésias. During the premiere, the play received contrasted reactions, but it set Apollinaire as a founding figure of budding surrealist movement. Apollinaire is greatly weakened by his surgery, but still active in the artistic and intellectual world. He coins the word surréaliste, describing his play Les Mamelles de Tirésias, written in 1916. During the premiere, the play received contrasted reactions, but it set Apollinaire as a founding figure of the budding surrealist movement. Yet Apollinaire will not live to see his influence. Weakened by his wound, Apollinaire died of the Spanish flu 2 days before the armistice of the 11th of November, 1918. In the decade that followed Apollinaire's death, André Breton became the leader of the Surrealist movement with the support of Philippe Soupeau and Louis Aragon. André Breton was deeply affected by the violence and absurdity of war, first on the battlefield, then as he worked in a military ambulance. While in the medical environment, he developed interest in Freud's psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud occupies a crucial position in French and European intellectual history. If psychoanalysis was embraced by medicine as a way to cure neurosis and hysteria, it is above all an art of language, using language to dive back into what the mind fails to express. In a way, Freud simply applied the symbolist interest in analogy to the interpretation of dreams and the diagnosis of trauma through speech. André Breton would read Freud, but also symbolist authors like Lautréamont. He reads the frenetic prose poem Les Chants de Maldoror with Louis Aragon while in the hospital ward, and the wailings of Maldoror intertwine with, I quote, de hurlements et sanglots de terreur déclenchés par les alertes aériennes chez les malades, the wounded's howling and sobs of terror triggered by the airstrike alarms. In 1928, Breton writes a semi-autobiographical novel, Nadja, where the theory of surrealism serves as a frame for a brief but wild fit of passion. The real people evoked in the story disappear behind Breton's wish to render reality into a poetic prose form of outbursts of emotions and distorting reality. The novel ends on a statement on beauty that definitely separates it from harmony. La beauté sera convulsive ou ne sera pas. Beauty will be convulsive or not at all. Beauty will be convulsive or not be at all. For the surrealists, writing is not just the deciphering of analogies as the symbolists wanted it to be. It is also the art of random associations that are beautiful by their very lack of purpose, of meaning. It is also the art of random associations that are beautiful by their very lack of purpose or meaning. The surrealists are interested in automatic writing, in altered states of conscience through love and drugs, and in forms of creation that disrupt the author's grasp on his own work, such as the cadavres exquis, an exercise where a person would start a sentence and a second one would complete it, or where one would complete a text written by someone else without even having read it. Surrealism embraced traditional arts, but also made the most of the new possibilities offered by photography, as by Max Jacob, the photographer, or by the cinema, where the movement's influence will still be perceptible way into the 1950s through Jean Cocteau's Orphée, and even in the 70s through Jacques Demy's Peau d'âne. In 1924, Breton wrote the first Manifeste du Surrealisme, the Surrealist Manifesto. It paradoxically precipitated the separation of the Surrealist group. Indeed, as Breton wished to turn Surrealism into a dogma, the movement lost its vibrance and its appeal. 6 years later, in 1930, André Breton reiterates, publishing the Second Manifeste du Surrealisme, where he writes, "The simplest surrealist act is to go down the street, guns in hand, and to shoot as much as one can in the crowd. L'acte surréaliste le plus simple consiste, revolver au poing, à descendre dans la rue et à tirer au hasard, tant qu'on peut, dans la foule." Many, among whom Albert Camus, would hold this sentence against André Breton. Yet Breton's hypothetic character, shooting at random, is both a response to the fear of anarchist attacks that happened in Paris since the 1870s and an answer to what appeared as a thought experiment in André Gide's novel Les Caves du Vatican, published much earlier in 1914. Les Caves du Vatican presents a dense plot where each character's actions end up having tremendous consequences on others, even when these actions are prompted by erroneous beliefs, by deceit, or by misinformation. One of the central characters, Lafcadio, is obsessed with the idea of the acte gratuit, a gratuitous act, with no cause and no purpose. He commits a murder for no reason, but what he meant to be a gratuitous act marks the resolution of all the other characters' plotlines. For Gide, there is no such thing as a free and gratuitous act. The social condition of mankind implies that all our actions are likely to find root in other people's choices and to interfere with other people's life. The Surrealists ended up moving away from Breton. When the second Surrealist manifesto was published, Breton was derided as the Pope of Surrealism. Authors like Louis Aragon and painters like Picasso or Dali refused to see Surrealism as merely centered on the self. And as the ambient tensions grew before the Second World War, many saw literature and art as the last bastion of freedom against totalitarianism. The artistic mood in the 30s and 40s was haunted with the problem of individual and collective agency, which rekindled the interest in Greek tragedies. Set in a mythical past, they offered enough distance for reflections on contemporary events, but also on the human condition in general. Two cycles seem of particular interest across the period: the story of the Trojan War and the cycle of Oedipus. Jean Cocteau, whose style was close to Dada and to Surrealism, made Oedipus the subject of his play La Machine Infernale, originally created in 1932. More than the particular tragic fate of the hero doomed to kill his father and marry his mother, Cocteau is interested in how all the characters, even the Sphinx, find themselves wrapped into the same inevitable course of things. Cocteau's Sphinx is not a monster, but a beautiful young woman who knows she will die because of Oedipus. Jocast's cosmopolitan accent and ridiculous fear of aging contrast with the tragic fate that befalls her, a part that does not seem cut for her. No one believes Tiresias, who hobbles around being nicknamed Zizi by Jocaste. The comedic effect only increases the tension all through the play. Cocteau presents tragedy as a folded fabric pierced by a single pin. Unfolded, it would bear unpredictable holes, but the cunning eye knows that several unrelated events are linked to that single one stab by destiny. The play shows the Greek characters in the vulnerability of their humanity and associates the symbolist sense of unity behind different elements to the surrealist interest in the effect of randomness. Two of Jean Giraudoux' plays directly refer to the Iliad and its adaptations as tragedies in the 5th century. Jean Giraudoux wrote La guerre de Troie n'aura pas lieu in 1935 and Electre in 1937. La guerre de Troie n'aura pas lieu presents the last days before the start of the Trojan War. Hector, coming back from the front, is weary, unwilling to throw Troy into another war, and tries his best to convince Hélène to return to her husband. Although Paris is willing to let her go, Hélène seems reluctant. Hector forces a jurist to present arguments against the war, which the jurist only does when he is menaced with prison and poison. At the end of the play, the encounter with the Greek envoys seems to go well, as Ulysse remarks that Andromach's eyelashes remind him of Penelope's. The war is about to be avoided through the recognition of the characters' shared humanity. But at the last moment, all the endeavors for peace collapse because of a drunk character, and the Trojan War must happen. 2 years later, Giraudoux looks at the aftermath of the war and turns to the story of Electra. In his play, contrary to Sophocles and Euripides' account, Electra does not know yet that it is her mother, Clytemnestre, who killed Agamemnon with her lover Aegiste. Giraudoux describes the play as a tragédie bourgeoise, a bourgeois tragedy. The relationship between Clytemnestre and Aegisthus is put at the same level as the commonplace adultery of another couple, two people living in a town. When Clytemnestre hears the woman confessing to her husband that she cheated on him with Aegiste, her reaction proves to Electre that she is guilty. Immediately afterwards, prompted by Electre, Oreste avenges his father. The entire city falls into confusion and chaos. In the last scene, a beggar, who also serves as the narrator, looks at the city in flames and utters the final sentence of the play. Cela s'appelle l'aurore. This is called dawn. The horrors of violence and destruction only leave one hope, that the chaos might usher in the light of truth. The German occupation marked a change of tone in literature. Artistic productions were severely controlled by Germany in the occupied zone and by the Vichy regime in the south, and clandestine press became a necessity. Among the clandestine newspapers of significance, the Revue Combat, edited by Albert Camus, where Jean-Paul Sartre published, and Témoignages chrétiens, led by the Jesuit priest Father Pierre Chaillet. Among the plays created during the occupation, Jean Anouilh's Antigone is one of the most complex. Anouilh said he had been haunted by Sophocles' play, where Oedipus' incestuous daughter, Antigone, goes against the law edicted by her uncle Creon to bury her brother Eteocles. In the context of the occupation, the idea of the single individual standing against man-made laws was indeed topical. The play contains direct references to Sophocles, but also radical differences. Its modern setting also makes the characters seem very human and relatable, beyond their exceptional fate. Yet Anouilh brings in a new element of complexity. Both of Oedipus' sons died fighting each other. Following the Greek tradition, Anouilh makes clear that both brothers would have killed their own father for power, but Anouilh also makes Creon say that he simply picked the least gruesome of the two corpses for the official burial. Antigone's act of resistance is robbed of its meaning and justification, as the corpse is robbed of its identity. But she still has to do it and to die, because such is her fate, parce qu'elle s'appelle Antigone. Antigone's destiny is sealed by the very fact that she is named Antigone, and that this name does not allow her the quiet joys of family life with Aimon. Anouilh makes Creon seem extremely human. He is not Sophocles' tyrant carried away by hubris, but the exhausted, common-sense man trying to keep things together as the world collapses around him in front of a radical Antigone who refuses his offer to let her go secretly. The play premiered on February 1944 under the watch of the Germans and in spite of several power cuts, and its reception echoed its complexity. Anouilh was criticized for being too mild towards Creon, or too harsh or too mild against Antigone. The play was praised both by the far right and by the far left, by the occupation and by the resistance. Those who were favourable to the occupation saw the play as a condemnation of Antigone's lack of sense of compromise, as she rushes to her death like a nihilist. For the resistance, Antigone was a figure of rebellion in front of unjust authority and of loyalty even beyond death. The perennial success of this play, however, is that it grasps the tension between human aspirations and a crushing, inevitable fate. The war revealed the banality with which evil, cowardice, and betrayal could be committed. The climate of pusillanimity and permanent humiliation under the German occupation seemed to bring out the worst in everyone. As Sartre wrote in his play Huis Clos in 1944, which shows three characters trapped in hell gradually discovering how evil each of them had been, l'enfer, c'est les autres. Hell is other people. The conjuncture shed a merciless light on the conflict between the human aspiration to greatness and a destiny that seems to favour mediocrity at best and at worst, sheer evil. In L'Étranger, published in 1944, Albert Camus returns to the idea of a gratuitous murder. His hero, Meursault, the narrator, is strangely withdrawn from reality. The narrative is entirely from his point of view, while his indifference slides on the surface of the people and things around him. During a day at the beach under the blazing sun of Algeria, Meursault shoots an Arab, for no reason. After the first part displaying the strangeness of Meursault, the reader is exposed to the strangeness of mankind and to our mad wish to give meaning to the smallest details. The second half of the novel tells of Meursault's trial. What is held against him is that he went to the cinema right after his mother's death, or that he smoked by the side of her coffin during the watch. The final scene, right before Meursault's execution, presents an outburst of meaning in meaninglessness, on the sheer joy of being an individual, alone, under a vaulted starry sky. L'Étranger is contemporary of one of Camus' foundational essays, Le mythe de Sisyphe. Sisyphus was a king who showed his power by murdering his visitors. Shrewd and cunning, he angered the gods by escaping death twice, which earned him the eternal punishment of pushing a rock up a mountain only to see it roll down. Camus sees Sisyphus as a representation of the absurdity of human life. Our dearest loves, our strongest expectations, all our dreams and our projects are meant to be crushed, inevitably, by death. However, Camus reversed the curse into a blessing. In fighting against the weight of the stone and the will of the gods, even if he is bound to fail, or precisely because he is bound to fail, Sisyphus infuses his existence with meaning. As Camus writes, the struggle towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. La lutte elle-même vers les sommets suffit à remplir un cœur d'homme. Il faut imaginer Sisyphe heureux. For Camus, the absurd is the source of revolt, freedom, and passion, and is therefore not an obstacle but a condition to the fullness of a human destiny. Camus' absurdism, which he will develop in his next essays, is a response to Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. For Sartre, existence comes ahead of being, l'existence précède l'essence, and it is only through the finding of a meaning and a purpose that a human life can become fully itself. This is why Sartre argues in his 1947 essay Qu'est-ce que la littérature? That literature has to have a political or a social purpose, and that the pact between the one who writes and the one who reads is that the latter would see his conscience opened up, awakened from comfort and from alienation. Although Sartre had been a long-time collaborator of Camus' Revue Combat, the two authors fell off on philosophical and political questions in 1949. Camus did not take seriously Sartre's resistance a posteriori, as Sartre had been demobilized early in the war, arguing that his eyesight gave him balance issues, and earned his first teaching position as a substitute for a Jewish professor expelled during the Aryanization. Before the end of their friendship, though, Jean-Paul Sartre spoke highly of the novel La Peste, which Camus published in 1947. Camus had already been working on this novel in 1942 during the war, according to one of his letters to André Malraux. Sartre saw La Peste as an anti-Nazi and anti-collaboration allegory, showing the sudden outburst of a contagion of evil that causes rottenness and corruption. Camus insisted, however, that there was much more to the novel than a mere commentary on current affairs. Indeed, the novel is part of the same triad as the essay L'homme révolté and the play Les Justes, and the three explore the problem of individual agency in front of moral choices. Just like Sisyphus, the hero of La Peste, Rieux, knows that he is fighting for a desperate cause, but he has to go on fighting, just as Joseph Grand, in the novel, has to keep on trying to write his own book, and like Le Père Paneloux, has to go on searching for God, because it is the moral thing to do. Just like Sisyphus, the hero of La Peste, Rieux, knows that he is fighting for a desperate cause, but he has to go on fighting, just as Joseph Grand has to keep on trying to write his novel, and like Le Père Paneloux has to go on searching for God, because it is the moral thing that each of them must do, and that the only freedom left in front of fatality is to make the moral choice that would have been good in the absolute. Camus thus stands in opposition with two aspects of Sartre's political theory, namely that all violence is justified if the cause is right, and that one should not refuse to do something bad if it can have positive consequences. La Peste ends up praising unity as the supreme good, be it discovered through love, through friendship, or through having a common cause. The violence of the war and the way war overflowed people's daily life during the occupation and the Vichy regime did not only transcribe itself through stories of doom and gloom. It is also in these times that French writers in exile tried to seize the incommensurable importance of love. In 1941, while in exile in the United States, Raissa Maritain, a Catholic convert born in a Jewish family, whose husband Jacques Maritain played an important part in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, sketched the encounters and friendships that saved her and her husband from nihilism and led them to appreciate truth, beauty, and goodness as absolutes. Among these friends, she lists Henri Bergson, who restored metaphysics in the French intellectual world in the end of the 19th century, or Léon Bloy, who ended up being her godfather. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who was exiled in the United States as well, published one of the best sellers of the 20th century, Le Petit Prince, in 1943. Behind its endearing, childish tone, which made it a classic for children's literature, Le Petit Prince addresses such questions as addiction, love, and friendship with unequaled alliance of depth and simplicity, and it also talks of separation, grief, death, and bereavement. Le Petit Prince's interest in language and its blending of text and illustration connected, beyond the war, to Surrealism. Similarly, Boris Vian's L'écume des jours, published in 1947, tells of the love story of Colin and Chloé in a universe where the surroundings are affected by the characters' emotions. On their wedding night, a lotus flower settles in Chloé's lung, causing a disease that stifles her. The only way to cure her from the lotus flower is to surround her with other flowers in order to scare off the evil one. Colin spends his fortune in flowers to heal Chloé, and gradually their elegant home turns into a damp and dark swamp. Camus, Boris Vian, or Saint-Exupéry took their distance with anything that ended in ism. Their alliances and enthusiasm were not mapped on the political checker of their time. For instance, Camus, politically on the left or far left, admired the works of Georges Bernanos, who in many respects is a heir of the monarchists that rejected the Third Republic in 1870. The evolution of Georges Bernanos is a barometer of the complexities of the first half of the century and of a writer's conscience as he faces them. Born in 1888, Bernanos was young enough to undergo the direct influence of Léon Bloy, who died in 1917, and of Barbey d'Aurevilly, one of the masters of the psychological and religious novel. Born in 1888, Bernanos was young enough to undergo the direct influence of Léon Bloy and of Barbey d'Aurevilly, two of the masters of the psychological and religious novel, but also of the essay in the late 19th century. Both Bloy and Barbey could be seen as reactionaries, insofar as their response to the turmoils of their time was a non-negotiable faithfulness to monarchy as it was before 1793. During his youth, and through the First World War, Georges Bernanos was close to the Action Française, with whom he shared his royalist nationalism. It is in the mud and blood of the Great War that Bernanos found the inspiration for his 1926 novel Sous le soleil de Satan. A young priest, l'Abbé d'Onissan, faces Mouchette, a young girl who became the mistress of a disreputable man whose only dignity is his aristocratic name. Through his confrontation with Mouchette, l'Abbé d'Onissan discovers the banality of evil. He tells Mouchette that there is nothing original, nothing special, nothing revolted in her sin. She only submitted to a long chain of all the sins committed around her and before her. The novel drifts towards what Barbey d'Aurevilly would have called supernaturalism. The real world is tightly intertwined with the supernatural. Bernanos described the novel as a furious dream he had during the war. The path of l'Abbé d'Onissan from the mud of the rut where he falls and meets the devil to his death, is allegorical of a faith that dares to see evil face to face. Bernanos returns to the character of the young priest 10 years later in Le Journal d'un curé de campagne, the diary of a countryside priest. The story unfolds in a countryside parish where the young priest, first derided by the peasants and the noble landowners, undergoes a mystical experience after which people feel compelled to spill out their worst secrets in front of him. In this story of reversibility, the aristocratic wife hides her grudge against God, the prude governess hides her adultery, the young men and women of the parish hide their lust, but salvation is promised to the most devilish character when the young woman lets go of her pride. Bernanos' writings present truth as the supreme good, especially in the essays he writes about Franco's Spain in Les Grands Cimetières sous la Lune. Bernanos resents the lies on which totalitarianism is built. The anti-Semitic propaganda of the Nazi regime, for instance, disgusts him. He thus takes his distance with the right, the far right, and the entire press of his time, as he writes in Scandale de la Vérité, Scandal of the Truth, "None of those who did me the honor to read me could believe I am associated with the hideous anti-Semitic propaganda unleashed today in the allegedly national press under orders from the occupier. Aucun de ceux qui m'ont fait l'honneur de me lire ne peut me croire associé à la hideuse propagande antisémite qui se déchaîne aujourd'hui dans la presse dite nationale sur l'ordre de l'étranger." Yet there is chiefly one truth that Bernanos wants to defend, a truth that he borrows from Léon Bloy, from Barbé d'Aurevilly, and from Sainte Thérèse de Lisieux. That truth is the last line of the Journal d'un curé de campagne. Tout est grâce. All is grace. In a world torn apart by violence, where some find a reason to live in politics and others through embracing absurdity, Bernanos holds the faith that there is such a thing as a providence, and that all that happens is either willed or allowed by God. Bernanos' very last work, Dialogue des Carmélites, was meant to be a screenplay adapting Gertrude van Lefort's short story, The Song at the Scaffold, about the Carmelites of Compiègne who were executed during the French Revolution. Blanche de la Force, the pathologically fearful nun, dies a martyr's death on the scaffold. Bernanos emphasizes that there seems to have been a surprising exchange, as the mother prioress of the convent died in horrible pain, even cursing God, but she was the only one to trust and believe Blanche de la Force's vocation, as though the brave and courageous nun had paid the price for the martyrdom of the weak one. Bernanos illustrates the communion of saints, the reversibility of merits, a dogma according to which there is no such thing as meaningless suffering, as the innocents who suffer continue the sacrifice of Christ on the cross by offering their pain for those who are guilty or those who cannot offer up their own sacrifice. Bernanos' understanding of pain is radically different from that presented by André Malraux, who was on the Nazis' blacklist for being a communist and one of the key figures of the French cultural field of the Fifth Republic. In La Condition Humaine, published in 1933, the main character, Gersor, says that all pain that helps no one is absurd. Toute douleur qui n'aide personne est absurde. Pain must have a purpose. Beyond their differences, both Bernanos and Camus would object to this statement. For Camus, pain is the touching stone that reveals moral fortitude and an individual's real intensity. In Bernanos' spiritual view of the world, heavily influenced by Léon Bloy's understanding of the reversibility of merits, pain does have a purpose, but an eschatological one. Bernanos refuses to reduce humanity to political agency and sees the bond between humans as irreducible to temporal reality. The philosopher Simone Weil, a friend of Albert Camus, who remained all her life close to communism, also found in the communion of saints a response to the horror of meaningless suffering and violence. In La Pesanteur et la Grâce, as an answer to the horrors of war, but also to the physical pain she went through, Simone Weil writes, "An innocent who suffers casts the light of salvation on evil. He is the visible image of the innocent God. Therefore, a God who loves man, a man who loves God, must suffer. Un innocent qui souffre répand sur le mal la lumière du salut. Il est l'image visible du Dieu innocent. C'est pourquoi un Dieu qui aime l'homme, un homme qui aime Dieu, doivent souffrir." From the Third Republic to the institution of the Fifth Republic, people had to make sense of a world that kept collapsing. The instability of the state disclosed human vulnerability under a new light. The first half of the century is undeniably bleak, as though the liberations granted by the collapse of politics, of society, and of academic art still strive to reconquer a lost unity or to embrace full fragmentation. If Surrealism dissociated art from technical mastery, it also sacralized the artist as a marginal. This marginality was seen by some as a legitimacy for political action, and by others as a license to break free from all constraints. However, the core question of free will in front of fate still posed itself in different ways and generating different reactions, from the wish for independence in the colonies to the wish for retrieving a higher sense of purpose for humanity as a whole. The overview of the main works of French literature from the end of absolute monarchy to the constitution of France as we now know it under the shape of the Fifth Republic testifies to the intricate connection between arts and politics. However, the changes that affected literature were not mere repercussions of political changes. Sometimes literature was ahead of politics and conditioned the way people of several generations envisioned their part in society. Above the relation between literature and politics, more essential interrogations are constantly at stake. Interrogations about the transformative power of passion, the distance between truth and reality, the possibility of representing what is not visible, and the right or the duty to write about love, truth, beauty, and justice.